answer. Let me admit people. All right. So Volga Bulgars. What you see on the picture here is a mosque from the Volga Bulgar area, but again, this is obviously a replica. It's not how it looked. And you know, if you think of it, the fully independent Volga Bulgars kind of became independent in the 10th century after the Khazars were destroyed by Russian knyaz. First destroyed by Oleg, and then secondly destroyed by Sviatoslav. But what's interesting is Bulgars used that opportunity to kind of establish their reign around the area and start conquering a lot of Ugro-Finnic people. But mostly interesting, there's not a lot of chronicles from especially Volga Bulgar. So what's interesting is with them is how they developed to be a nation. 1 second. Can somebody mute it? I feel apologies. Can you hear me? Is it better? I'm just hearing.
Yes.
Oh God, what's going on? Let me mute everybody for now. Or if you can mute yourself, guys. Okay, it's perfect. No, it's like, what the hell? Is it me? I think it's me. 1 second. What's wrong? Can you hear me better now? Yes. So,
yeah.
Volga Bulgars. Again, this is a mosque, as I was saying, and this is their sigil. On the left, this is their flag sigil of Volga Bulgars. It has a dragon, and obviously from the name, you could perceive they're Volga Bulgars. So what is the origin of Volga Bulgars? I mean, originally they came from the, Asia Minor. But as we have, I don't know if you guys saw Richard's presentation, he was talking about Hunnic movement from, steppes of China all the way to the West world. This is what you have to think of. This is all this big wave coming from China, ending in Asia Minor. And around 485 to 492, we have this appearing independent Han in Central Asia. His name is Kagan. Sorry, I'm meeting somebody. His name is Kagan Tulun, and he lived from 485 to 492. He basically revolted against this huge tribe that was attached to the Hunnic movement. Part of it was called Jajan. And basically his revolt, he became to establish himself as, Bulgar or somebody that resembles that area. And through the homelands in Kazakhstan and, and then moving north mostly to Caucasian steppes, basically we have something that's called Proto Bulgars. So who are the Proto Bulgars? Okay. Let me go to the next page. So let me just show you the map. So we have ancient Proto-Turkic people. As you remember, there's a Turkish Khaganate was created, huge Khaganate. Then we have Avars coming from it, so on. And then you have a wave that's, coming into the right. And then you have this Bulgar Turkic people that are being created through, if you know, mostly in the East, after the Turkish Khaganate was kind of weakened, there was something that's called Oghur Khaganate that came out. And part of the Oghur Khaganate was this Bulgar Turkic people. And they divide between Kazars, which is what we're going to talk about. And that's how they're related, Michael, as well, and Bulgar, okay? Then within a Bulgar, Great Bulgaria was created around the area of Ukraine, okay? The Crimea, there was a Great Bulgarian kingdom, empire, you can call it. And basically, and we don't need to go through whole lineage, but I just wanted to show you that how the Turkic people kind of have the main Khaganate as their foundation, and then they spread around in different areas. Okay, so now we have this Bulgars that came out from this Oghur group, and so what's happening here now is from this Oghur group. You know, I already have spoken about the, you know, Hans. We have this Han Kubrat, okay? So we're going 200 years into the, from 400 when the Bulgar is created. King Kubrat basically moved in the area of Azov Sea, and, you know, and I'll show the map, and Ukraine, and basically, he created a huge Great Bulgaria. The Great Bulgaria, they were not obviously, you know, Muslim or Christian or Jewish or any of that stuff. They were, you know, they were practicing Tangric religion. And what's interesting, he basically had 5 sons, right? So let me talk about him a little bit. So this guy, King Gobrad, is the first to lay a foundation of Bulgar military and tribal alliance. He forms the capital of Fanagoria and Taman, Peninsula near Crimea, and we'll get to the map. It has been suggested that he was working with Eastern Roman influence. Basically, the Roman, you know, you have different tribes that are attacking, you know, the Muslims are attacking from the east. You have establishment of different Slavs, Moravian attacking Eastern, you know, Roman Empire, and then here they're establishing a good relationship with Byzantium, Bulgar Khaganate, and this Kubrat is deriving, you know, and the first emperor that established a good relationship was, his name is Heraclius. He's very well known, and as we know, Romans always used buffer zones, and they use Bulgars as a buffer zone. So in 651, he dies, and he has 5 sons. So now he tells his 5 sons, well, I have, you know, well, not time, and he died. I mean, he basically gave me his will. He said, I would like you to rule my area where I live. And they said, no, sorry, we can't. We don't agree with each other. And by the way, they found his grave in Ukraine, in an area called Perchepnina in Ukraine, and there was a plenty of treasure. In 1912, it was discovered of this guy, Han Kubrat. All right, so this is the beginning of Bulgaria. So this is a map, right? So now you have a great, you know, Khaganate of Bulgaria in the area where the Khazars are. Great Bulgaria right here, you see this? You see this, oops, sorry, right here. Great Bulgaria, and you know, Hazars is just being, you know, established and stuff. And he has 5 sons. Now, 5 sons are saying, okay, what do we need to do now? We don't agree with each other. So one son decided to go to Volga River. One son decided to go to Bulgaria, Pannonia, or the, you know, Thracian area of. Another son decided to go to you know, even as far as Italy. And so they basically spread around. And what's interesting is the son that goes to Volga, you know, and I'll get to him as well, he is getting subjugated by Khazars, as you can see them on the right. And therefore, you know, he's no longer, you know, an independent king. And for 200 years, he lives under subjugation of Khazars, okay? Again. All right, so now what's interesting is now this Bulgars arriving in the area, from the Black Sea area, all the way to Volga. About 600, they founded old Great Bulgaria, which was destroyed by Hazar in 668. Kubrat's son, an appointed heir, Barbayan Bezmer, moved from the Azov region in about 660 AD, commanded by Khazarian Khan Kodrat, to whom he had surrendered. Then he reached Idel Ural in the 8th century, where they became a dominant population in the end of 9th century, uniting other tribes, different region, which lived in the area. Some Bulgar tribes, however, continued westward and eventually settled along the Danube River, what is now known as Bulgaria proper, where they created a confederation of Slavs adopting a South Slavic language and Eastern Orthodox faith. So we're not going to talk about those Bulgars. We're going to talk about Bulgars that went to Volga. All right. And this is the depiction. Obviously, it's, his 5 sons going to different direction, basically. So most scholars agree that Volga Bulgar was subject to Hazarian Empire until mid-10th century, where the Bulgars no longer paid tribute to them. Threat from the Khazarian was completely gone after the Khazari destruction and conquest by Sviatoslav, which I mentioned, in 10th century, after which Volga Bulgaria grew greatly in size and power. Sometime in the 9th century, unification process started and capital was established in Bulgar. In fact, that's the name of the capital, Bulgar city, which is 160 kilometers from a modern Kazan. Okay, and we'll get to the map. And this is the other side of them going to Danube, where the Thracians used to live, and his name was Hanas Paruch, and he's very famous in striking a deal, obviously, with Byzantine King Heraclius and Basil, and establishing Great Bulgaria in that area. So we're talking about 2 Bulgarias. Now, so that's where we spoke about. So Volga Bulgaria. So
question?
Go ahead.
That previous graphic you were showing there, is that bunny chant somebody, the one with the king and his sons?
Yeah.
That one. That wouldn't by any chance be the parable of the twigs of the arrows, would it?
I'm sorry, I missed a parable.
No, I'm looking at a guy kind of waving his hand at a pile of twigs. Would that be the parable of the, I've seen variations of that. I think they did, the movie Ran with Akira Kurosawa, where the guy demonstrates he can easily break a single arrow, but he can't break 5 arrows sticking together.
Yeah, I mean, there was something to that regard, but...
So it's saying stick together and you won't be conquered.
Yes, that was part of his conversation, yeah. He said, if you hold one fist, and ironically he had 5 sons, the 5 fit, I mean, if you hold the fist, strong, it obviously won't break. But if you, obviously separate and open your palm, you guys are going to all get conquered. And sure enough, the person that went to Volga got conquered by Khazars, and Volga Bulgars were no longer independent on that side. The ones that went to the, Moravia and Thracian area next to Byzantium did much better. And Asparuch actually still was called a Khan, even though he converted to Orthodoxy, he still was called, interestingly enough, in the Byzantine chronicles, they still used to call him Hans, which is particularly not a knyaz, which is another word of saying, a high, like a sultan or high society person. This was called, this was interesting. So they are actually very strongly aligned to tribal. But as we know, Bulgaria and Danube, they're mostly Slavs, but originally they obviously were Turkic population. And what I heard is when they went to Danube, there was probably around 20 to 30,000 of them. And then when assimilated, they basically fully assimilated. There are literally no Turkic blood in DNA of Bulgarians that live in Eastern Europe. But these Bulgarians are called right now closely Tartars and Chuvash. Chuvash are Turkic people that are closely alienated with Volga Bulgars. I don't know if you ever heard of Chuvash ethnicities. All right. So let's move on. All right, so just want to show on the map, this is Volga Bulgars. You have Hazar Khaganate. You have smaller Bulgar Khaganate, closer to current Hungary, Magyars. And then, obviously you have, Russia on top, and stuff like that. Pechenegs which were the also Turkic people. So anyway, after they became independent, and what helped them to become independent is their conversion to Islam. Okay, so as you can see, Abbasid Caliphate sent a couple of missions to, obviously this would be the most Western world Muslim conglomerate, to Volga Bulgars. And this is what happened. Volga Bulgars adopted Islam in 922 before Russia became Christian, actually. In 921, Almas sent an ambassador, or Abbasid Caliph Almas sent an ambassador. Almas was the Volga Bulgar Khan, sent the ambassador to Caliph requesting religious instructions. Next year, an embassy returned with Ibn Fadlan as secretary. A significant number of Muslims already lived in the country. So even before Ibn Fadlan entered Volga Bulgars, there were already Muslims living in the country. Why was it important, obviously, that to have monotheistic religion in this area? You have a Byzantium. You have Khazars that already converted to Judaism. You have Russians that later converted to Orthodox Christianity. And in fact, they said that Volga Bulgars almost converted Russians to Orthodox Christianity, but it was believed so that the Russian king Oleg said, well, let's drink to our conversion. And he said, oh, no, we don't drink. Muslims don't drink. And he goes, well, we're Russians and we have to drink. I apologize. We have to go with a different religion. That's not possible for us. I mean, it's a story, obviously. It's not, there's other, probably because they're very closely aligned to Byzantium. There was a lot of trade going on in Russia. So is Volga. Volga Bulgars had a lot of trade with Byzantium, but most of the trades were with Abbasid Caliphate. So now, what's interesting, who is Ibn Fadlan? So it's this person that goes and converts or help convert Volga Bulgars to Muslim religion. Ibn Fadlan was born in 877 in Baghdad, died in 960 AD, lived in Islamic Golden Age, obviously, as a member of Abbasid Caliph. He was expert in Islamic jurisprudence and faith. He was also a traveler and theologian and in service of Abbasid Caliphate. So what's interesting is he traveled all the way from Abbasid, and this is his picture, right? Traveled all the way from Abbasid Caliphate into the Volga Bulgar area. Look at the journey. At some point when he was in area of Kharazm, which is the kingdom right here, oops, sorry, in the area of Kharazm, which is right here next to Aral city, his whole mission, is getting attacked by pirates. And he is left with like maybe 50 of his closest friends. He said, no, I'm going to keep going. They told him, we have no provision, we have nothing left. He goes, no, it's important for me to go and convert this, Hunnic Bulgar people that don't believe they're still, into this Tangrian, religion. And some of them are already trying to convert. So we would need to do that. And he continued through that. In a way, he also met Russians, which is, he called them Rus. He had a name for it, basically. He called them Viat. And he actually monitored one of the Russian or Viking, at the time they were conglomerate of Viking or Russian boyars, which is the royalty, how he died and how he was buried. He was basically thrown into ship, and a lot of the slave, women were thrown with him and burned. The ship was burned while it was, leaving the harbor. There was a burial, and he witnessed it, and he also wrote about it. So what's interesting is, with the promise of conversion to Islam, Volga Bulgars was promised 4,000 dinars from Abbasid Caliphate, Baghdad. But at the time, the Arabs weren't doing too hot, and they were losing battle after battle, and therefore that 4,000 dinars never arrived. Who knows? Maybe they, somebody expropriated on the way. So it's such a long journey. So somebody might be expropriated on the way there. Yeah, and let's go to the next slide. Sorry, my thing is just. So who was the one that accepted the Muslim religion? His name was Han al-Mush, which, as I've mentioned, and made it an official religion of Volga Bulgars. So what's interesting is, what was Bulgars known for? Okay, so we already know this. So Bulgars, since they lived, in a Volga River, this is, sorry, this is let me look at the map. They lived next to the Volga River. They were in a very interesting and intricate trading outpost, and they did a lot of trading with Abbasid Caliphate. So much of the trade in the capital Bulgar was a thriving city, rivaling the size and the wealth with the greatest cities, in the world, and trade partners of Bulgar included the Vikings, Ugra, Nenets, which were the Ugra-Finnic people, and the north to the Baghdad and Constantinople in the south, in the Western Europe to China in the east. So Bulgars were very famous. It was interesting is Rus had a number of wars with Volga Bulgars. The Rus principalities to the west posed an only tangible military threat. So there's only steppes on the right, and on the left you have all those Rus. And then, basically in the 11th century, the country was devastated by several raids from Russian, Rus principalities, especially rulers of Vladimir, and notably Andrew the Pious and Vsevolod III. And so they also did raid Russian cities as well. So they weren't just the ones, being raided as well. So any questions on Volga Bulgars or any additions that you guys have? Because I'm so eager to go to Kazars, and it's much more interesting, but any questions?
Yes. I don't know if you had explained this, because my computer suddenly conked out, and I'm on my iPad now. Sure. So I may have missed it, but what's the relationship between the Volga Bulgars and like modern Bulgaria?
There is none.
There is none? It's just the name?
No. This is what happened. I tried to, let me just go up a little bit. So they had a common ancestor, but only non-Slavic, Turkic. So this person, his name is Khan Kubrat, and his 5 sons dispersed in 5 different directions. One son went to Volga, one son went to Danube, another son, went, in the area of Azov, another son went to the area of Italy. The son that went to the Danube, his name is Asparuh. He was the last pretty much known Turkic Khan that converted to Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, and the people of Bulgars, there were 20 to 30,000 of them that initially arrived into Danube area, got assimilated with Slavs, and their DNA is, if you do a DNA of Bulgarians right now, you would see none of that. And the Volga Bulgars, even though they have a common so-called Proto Bulgarian ancestry, they're actually right now this, their descendants is Tartars and Chuvash people, which is a Turkic people. So
yeah, well, okay, so that explains why the Volga Bulgars would be Turkic, whereas the Bulgarians we know about are Slavic. So that's good. You got there. You made the explanation. Thanks. I understand now.
Zach, I have a question. So what was the period then of the Volga Bulgars? So the Volga Bulgars don't really exist as such anymore.
No,
I guess the Chuvash. So what were the dates of the beginning and the end of the Volga Bulgars?
So it goes from about 640 to all the way to 1230s, when they were conquered by Batu. Batu was the son of Genghis Khan. And what's interesting about the fight is Batu had sent an auxiliary forces to fight Volga Bulgarians, and the auxiliary forces of about 20,000 Mongols lost to the Volga Bulgarians. They were able, just like Jalal al-Din, they were able to beat Mongolians. That was the first defeat after Jalal al-Din in Khazaria, in Khwarezm. It was the first defeat. Obviously, Batu later came in with the main force and destroyed, and still kept Bulgar as the main city, and the city was still thrived until 1433. But we don't hear anything about Volga Bulgars after 1250. So they were assimilated with other Mongolic Turkic people, and Bulgar was still a thriving city up until 15th century. And I was able to answer the question. Sorry.
Yep. Thanks. Very good.
Yeah. Any other questions? Oh, there was a question online. Sorry. So, what really did they start off? What Orthodox strain did they adopt? Oh, they adapted the Byzantium orthodoxy. It was not Greek orthodoxy. And what's interesting is later on in life, when Basil III destroys Bulgaria, a lot of their scholars go to Russia and are being protected by Russians, which we know Russia also adopted the orthodoxy from Byzantium as well. And because of the survival, not Syrian, no, not Syrian orthodoxy or Coptic, no, none of that. So, and I think that's more coming to they're more related to, I mean, you're right. I mean, it's more from the Western Greece, I guess you would think of it. But this was more Byzantium. And what's interesting is because of it, Russian Orthodoxy became so strong because of Bulgarians, and Moravian scholars that and then as, I remember speaking back, Ralph also pointed, because of Methodi and Cyril, we also have an alphabet, Cyrillic alphabet, because it was developed for the monasteries in Bulgaria and Moravia. And then it moved into Russia, and thanks to that, we have Cyrillics. So that was a very strong connection there. Do we know anything about the early mystical religion? Yeah, Tangric, they were Tangric, they were, it was not monotheistic, mostly Tangric, shamanism religion. And I'll talk about Hazaria, it was very close to how Hazars, because it's important for Hazars, the religion is important as well as for the Bulgars. But as I'm going to talk about Hazars, I'll mention what they were practicing, and I'm assuming Bulgars were practicing. Both left no chronicles of any kind. Forest, tree man, etc. Yeah, basically. Well, so is Russians. I mean, right now there's a big move for Russians. They're coming back to the, I don't know if you know that they have this religions called, Drevichis or whatever. It's like they pray to the trees, and idols and stuff like that. So that's an interesting aspect of it. Now it's a big move in Russia to stray away from Orthodoxy and go into that. So anyway, for the sake of time, I just want to move to Khazaria because you guys are going to slam me with questions on that one. And then if there's going to be more questions, Bulgaria will attest to that. So, Jewish Khaganate, rise and fall of Khazars, right? I've kind of already mentioned how they fell, but let me just originally notice an interesting geographer and a writer from the Caliphate wrote about Khazaria. In Khazaria, sheep, honey, and Jews exist in large quantities. What did he mean? All right, let's go to the next. What does that mean? So background. So who were the Khazars? I already mentioned. Khazars were the conglomerate of semi-nomadic Turkic tribes from Asia from 5th to 6th century CE, or earlier. They lived in a territory between North Caucasus and Lower Volga and southern part of today's European Russia. So right now there's some scholars at Harvard that actually say that Kievan Rus was found by Khazars. That's how far they even came there before Slavs. And obviously, Crimea was part of the Hazarian territory, and we'll go into that as well. So what was part of the Khazaria? It was modern-day Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Moldova, Russia, Turkey, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. It was huge. I mean, it's, you can't even, and they were very strong. All right. So the tribes that made up a Khazar identity were living in the area of Pontic-Caspian steppe, straddling northwest shore of Caspian Sea, and probably formed a part of the eastern section of Hunnic tribal hierarchy. So they were part of the Hunnic hierarchy, and when they, Khans moved out. And what's interesting is they broke away around 600 in 6th century, by 500 AD, and almost subjugated all the people around them. The tribes in Caucasus Mountains, such as Sabians, Salmondas, Balonjars, and others. The Khagan strength was confirmed when its Western Turks made an alliance with Byzantium against Persia. So when Sassanids were fighting against Byzantium, they used Khazars to protect them against the Sassanids. And what's interesting is the Turkic, that was the name of the Khan at the time, Yakbu, with whom the Emperor Heraclius formed his pact, seemed to have been relatively autonomous. So they already had broken away from Hunnic rule. And basically, there was a chronicle, his name is the Fan, and he called them Kazars, basically. So there was already chronicles in 7th century that was writing about Kazars and the particular striking a deal with Heraclius. So now what's interesting is, I just want to show you the map. So here's Khazars. You have Pechenegs, you have Volga Bulgars, Kipchaks, and Russians right here. But obviously Khazars had all these territories to themselves, Armenia, Georgia, and we'll talk about later, but there's also a relation with Magyars, particularly when it comes to Jews as well. So around 630, Islamic Rashidun.
Zach, could I interrupt a question? What's the relationship of the Kazars with the current day Kazakhs?
No relations. Khazars, just a Turkic tribe, completely disappeared. And there is a claim that Karaites, that were a Jewish tribe, they were descendants of Khazars.
Now the Kazakhs are also Turkic, aren't they?
They're Turkic, but they came from Yenisei Kyrgyz. They're not related. It's a completely different wave and came much later. So
Okay.
it's that Uzbeks came from Volga River, and they might be more related to Khazars than Kazakh. They're a little bit different waves, and Uzbeks came in like almost 14th century. Was mostly the area was mostly the Persians was lived in Uzbekistan. That's Persians and Mongols. So around 630 AD, Islamic Rashidun armies were making their westward advance and met Khazars in 642. And so what's interesting is, so you have this Islamic armies coming from this area, and there is a city, it's called Derbent, which is in current day Azerbaijan, and they met Khazars there. So without Khazars, so to speak, the westward movement of Arabs would not have been stopped. So basically, the conflict arose between Khazars and Arabs, or Rashidun armies of Umayyad Caliphate. And it was for 8 years that, they were trying to break through and get to the Khazars, destroy them, and then go on their way to Byzantium. They left and they tried to attack Byzantium. We all know about the sieges of Constantinople by Arabs that didn't really work. But who is to say that the whole Western culture wouldn't be transformed without Khazars interfering, okay? So it's interesting, during a lot of this fighting with Arabs, the Khazar army used a lot of the ballista and catapult artillery to repel repeated Arab assaults, okay? So they have used a very advanced, how did they get all this catapult and ballista, technology? Is because they're in the middle of this Silk Road. Not in the middle, but almost at the tier, like upper end of the Silk Road. And therefore, all this technology came to them, and they had all that technology, and now how they were able to repel Arabs. So there was an interesting battle that was actually, not battle, but a fight that was lasted between Khazars and Arabs for 15 years. And both of them were extremely fanatic. Khazars probably more fanatic, and due to the fact that Tangric religion is before the conversion to Judaism, and at one point there was a note in 721. There was the fight broke out between Arabs, and one village in Khazar village, they basically committed a suicide as in groups. As a group, they burned themselves not to give up themselves to the Arab. To Arabs, maybe they didn't want to get converted. So now, and this is, basically they were talking about one of the campaign. On the campaign of the war, Khazar invaded modern Azerbaijan. So now Khazars are invading into a Muslim area in 730, AD, led by the Bark-Ik, or son of the Kogan, which Kogan has nothing to do with Jewish. Kogan is the leader of the Khazars. It seems to have been a traditionally merciless warlord who callously ordered his heavily armored, light-skinned, red-haired, blue-eyed Khazars cavalry forced to slay any Muslim that came across. After marching his men forced toward Adabel, which is in Azerbaijan, Khazar armies met a 25,000 strong Arab force and outside the city wall and totally crushed it, killing the commander Al-Jarrah ibn Abdallah in the process. But what's interesting is they crushed it, but this is a nomadic tribe, right? So what they did is they start running around and start plunging the areas because they wanted the loot. And therefore, Arabs came back, and that's how the war has been happening. The Khazars would beat them, and the people would go scatter to loot the areas, and Arabs came back and, you know, basically beat them back. Now, what's interesting is when Arabs stopped coming to Khazaria is when Umayyad Caliphate basically went out. Let's go to the next slide. Religion. Khazaria was an officially Jewish state, right? Having converted in 740 AD. In the beginning of the 8th century, the Mediterranean world was primarily polarized between Christian and Islamic faith. So I'm saying why they converted. So you have two different areas. You have a Byzantium on the Christian side. Obviously they're trying to convert Russians, and which they did. You have Islam faith converting Volga Bulgars, converting others. Now the Khazars are very strong. They want to be the third. They don't want to be, subjugated to either Christians or Islam. They want to have their own faith. So what happened is they basically, picked up a Jewish religion. But what's interesting, the Khazars Empire was a power of its own, which represented a formidable force and had proved itself a diplomatic and military equal to Caliphate and Roman Empire. Having realized the Tangar religion could not grant legal or dynastic legitimacy like the great monotheistic faith could. So they basically said, you know what, we have to pick up one of the monotheistic religion because it's going to give us more, dynastic legally. However, they said we could not accept Christianity, Islam, which would insubordinate them to one of the either Byzantium or Arab Caliphate. But there's a certain trend that we can explain in this conversion. Even before Khazar accepted Judaism, there was extensive connection with Jewish and their religious practices. There were old prominent Jewish communities in the Crimean and Taman Peninsula, which had existed ever since Greek and Roman times, living in cities such as Pankupean and Phanagoria, which was a Greek town. So basically, if you go back to the map, they're saying that in this area, Jews already lived. And therefore, when Khazars came, they kind of, assimilated with Jewish people, and therefore took up their religion, and on top of it, didn't want to be subjugated to the Byzantium or Muslim Caliphate. Any questions before I move
on? Zach, may I make a comment?
Sure.
If you go to previous slide, no, the one which shows, yeah, this one. It says that on the right that the theory is that Ashkenazi came from Khazars attached to anti-Semitic views. I don't understand it. I believe it's not opposite, but it's irrelevant, I would say. There is a book by Arthur Kostner, The 13th Tribe, where he investigates a theory that Ashkenazi came from Khazars. When Kazars were pushed by other nomadic tribes to the west, they ended up in Europe, in Poland, and so these areas where maybe some Germany, where Ashkenazi mostly lived afterwards. And that's why he concludes that, at least he hypothesizes that maybe Khazars made a bulk of further later Ashkenazi tribes there. When he was writing this, obviously genetics were not available, and later studies have shown that genetically it's not correct. So Ashkenazi have no genetic connections with Khazars. What he was saying in his book, I mean, Kostner, that it could be a very sad irony that when Nazis were claiming, saying, just killing Jews and saying that they want to eliminate Semites, that Khazars were actually not Semitic tribes, so Ashkenazi were not Semitic. It was his assumption, and he was musing about this. And but we know now that it's not true. But I don't understand where these words came from and why this theories about Ashkenazi being originated in Khazar Khaganate have any anti-Semitic connotation.
So this is why, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but my understanding is they're saying that those Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, has no legitimacy to the Middle Eastern Jews that came from, and therefore, you know, descendant of Moses and Abraham, and therefore have no claim to the fame, so to speak. So they're, and that's what that's how I pick up. I don't know if
okay, I understand that.
Yeah.
No claim to what?
So they, you know, basically the Jews were original apostles of the Christianity. So the Hitler wanted to find something to, or the anti-Semitic people would want to find something that not to connect them with Jesus Christ, not to connect to those original Jews in Mediterranean, or the Israel, and nothing to do with the first or second destruction of temple, nothing to do with Torah or the Old Testament.
I think it would have an anti-Zionist kind of connection, because if this theory were true, then most Jews who came to Israel as their ancient homeland would actually have no genetic connection with that ancient homeland, because they'd be Turkic in origin and not not descended from the ancient Israelites.
Yeah, not Semitic.
Yeah, but of course, the way I think of it, when you look at when most scholars look at the evolution of Yiddish, which was the common language of Ashkenazi Jews, that it actually developed in the west of Europe, basically the northeastern part of France, and then the Rhineland area into Germany, and the Jews basically moved east. So they moved from a totally different part of the continent, and Yiddish is supposed to have evolved from a movement of people going from west to east.
Mm-hmm. Right. And also there are genetics which show clearly its Semitic origins.
Right.
And that obviously there was no DNA analysis, Ralph and Mikhail. So therefore they were saying they're the fake Jews, and therefore we can have a claim to did what he did, Hitler, what I'm saying? So that was his whole, but again, who would believe that psychopathic,
yeah, he doesn't need our excuses,
it's sad, obviously. So anyway, how do we know? I apologize, and thank you if you guys finished that. There's one more.
Yeah, sure.
There's one more question. I apologize.
No problem.
How do we know that they converted Judaism, and how did they do it? So from what I've read and from what I understand, the people didn't convert wholeheartedly, and later actually they converted to Muslim religion around the 11th century due to the fact of geopolitical closeness to the caliphate at that time was Abbasid, and therefore only the cream de la creme or the bureaucracy converted to Judaism, from what I heard, but not common people. So it's not. So the Jews that lived there were Jewish, and the Kagan himself converted, and his close, close people and all the bureaucracy, and that's it, pretty much. And that's how they converted. And what wave? From the correspondence with Al Shaprut, I understand, it was more related to the Kievan Rus, and Kievan Rus, had Jews living in Kiev even prior to conversion to Khaganate, and that's how the Harvard professors think that Kievan Rus was actually initially, founded by Khazars, not by Varangians, because of the fact that they actually have an area in Kiev. It's called Zhidovi Varota, which means Zhid means a Jew in Ukrainian. It's very derogatory, by the way, but that's what they call it, and it's been out there since 780. If anybody, I don't know, Mikhail knows about it, stuff like that. So now, how did they reinforce this religion? So now Leo get a word, Leo, who was the in Syria and Byzantium, emperor, gets a word of there's a Khaganate that's Jewish, starts prosecuting and want to convert and baptize the Jewish citizens in his empire, and they flee mostly from Byzantium area into Khaganate. Then they also not an expulsion, not by big numbers, but from the Muslims area, from Umayyad and Abbasid, they also go to Khaganate. So it becoming quite a Jewish staple. How do we, what also reinforced their religion there as well? So what's interesting is, before we get to that, I just want to talk about, I don't know, have you ever heard of Red Knights? Let me just go to the next. It's the Jewish merchants. The Jewish merchants were called Red Knights. This is how it's spelled. I don't know if I correctly said it. So they were an interesting clan. One of the Arabic scholars wrote about them an interesting fact. He said, these people know about 9 or 8 languages, and they travel throughout the world, and they actually, very amazing merchants. So they go from, let's say, China, India, and apparently they had settled in Itil, which was the capital of Hazaria, and a lot of the obviously particularly Arabic scholars write about the Red Knights, saying they either came from they got initiated in Rhode, France, or they, or somewhere in Mediterranean. But they're the Jewish merchants that speak about 9 to 10 languages. They went around and did amazing things. I mean, think about it. You have a Muslim living in Umayyad. You have Christians living in Byzantium. They don't talk to each other. They fight, or they're going to use intermediaries. They're going to use Jews. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the scroll on the right. And let me just show it. I think there's more to it. That's a merchant trade. We'll get to that. 1 second. Oh, this is, by the way, this is how Red Knights look. And this was a Tang dynasty. This is a Jewish merchants that traveled around the world, speaking 9 to 10 languages. And in China, they already had depicting them with a big, hump on the back. I don't know if it was anti-Semitic or anything, but that's basically what it is. So now, what do they write about the Khazaria itself? So, as you can see on the right, one second, let me just admit somebody. On the right, this is especially Hazard coin. And what is on the Hazard coin is the David Star. So this was, in fact, they used during the trade. What were the Hazard known for? According to the Hudul al-Alam, who was the Persian geographer and essayist, he said, this is a very pleasant and prosperous country with a great riches, from it becomes cows, sheep, and innumerable slaves. Yes, Hazars were involved in slave trade. And Radnites, particularly, the reason they're depicted that way is because they were one of the top slave traders in the area. And Hazaria, being the, in the midst of the Silk Road, were involved in it. Such a place has surprisingly attracted commercial activity from all quarters, straddling the trade routes along the Azov, Black Sea, Caspian Sea, Don River, and especially the Volga River. Hazaria functioned as a nexus for trade moving east and west, north and south, and this was allowed the Kagan make a killing from the Silk Road profits. Kazars exported natively produced cattle wax, honey, in addition to exotic wine, which was manufactured in Salmon Dar in Crimea. We all know about Crimean wine. Traders from Khazaria found their way to Volga Bulgar, Kharazm, India, China, even Sweden. There was a Khazarian outpost in Sweden at the Burka at the Lake of Malar. So Kazars probably were Radnite Jews that had an outpost and a little colony in Sweden. And there was a, obviously they imported and exported, and they had merchants living in Itil, the capital of Khazaria. And the Chinese merchants brought silk dresses, sophisticated bearers from a Tang Empire, while Arabs came in search of particularly prized Khazar fur. Where did they get the fur? From the Nordic states, from Russians, from Sweden, Norway. It was a big trade area. So the Radnite Jews particularly, so what is, basically, they said they either came from Mesopotamia or Rhode Valley in France, which I've had said before. And obviously they were prominent against Khazar merchants. In a book of the Persian writer, his name is Ibn Hardadbeh, he writes, in a book of Roots and Kingdoms, Persian geographer and explorer, Ibn Hardadbeh tells us that Radanites were an incredible multilingual community capable of speaking languages like Persian, Slavic, Spanish, Frankish, Greek, and Arabic. All right, let's get next to it. So, Jews government. So in government, so apparently the empire relied on a dual kingship, greater king who was a sacred figurehead, and a lesser king who dealt with the military and daily affairs. Since the empire was very tribe-based, there were also leaders of a different sections of the nation, similar to premier province. These leaders had some liberties, but they all still answered to the king. What happened is the Kagan, or the king, allowed the leaders of other factions to collect taxes. So if the Russian merchant or the Rus merchant came through the Hazars, Azov Sea, and there was a tribal leader nearby, he would have to pay double tax to the king, to the Kogan, and the tribal leader as well. Military. it was interesting military. Actually, they were special ops. There was no other way. If you ran away from the battlefield, you get killed. So therefore, people didn't like to face Khazars because they were extremely, first of all, they had a good connection with China, so they had a good equipment. They might have used, like I said, they used ballista, they used artillery. They had different type of know-how at the time. And also, they didn't like weak people. Like I said, there was one village that committed suicide, not to give themselves up to the Muslim overlords. Any questions? All right. So this is the current area of Russia. Just wanted to point out, basically, this is where the Khazaria would be. You have Volga River, Don River, and Aral Sea. It's incredibly huge territory right here. All right, I just want to show some artifacts. So as I've mentioned, they did convert to Muslim religion. It was short-lived, but they did. And some of the coins actually does show that. And some ended up in Baghdad. And that's basically it. Next one. All right. On the right, you can see a depiction of synagogue that was built in Itil, or the Khazars capital. So on the left is their coin, as I've mentioned before. And they did give Hebrew names to their kings. So, king on the 10th century, they have a King Joseph. In 9th century, they had King Benjamin, and they had King Aaron in the 10th century as well. They also had an adoption of Hebrew characters. All right. We'll get to that. All right, let's get to the correspondence. So everybody knows who Ibn Shaprut is, right? He lived in Al-Andalus, or the golden age of the Spain, jewelry. He had a correspondence with King Joseph, who was a Turkic king that converted to Judaism. And this is what, was all about. So the Hazard Correspondence is a set of documents which are alleged to date from 1950 or 1960, and to be letters between Hasda ibn Shaprut, foreign secretary of a Caliph of Cordoba, and a Joseph Hagan of Kazars. The correspondence is one of the only few documents attributed to Kazars authors, and potentially one of the only small numbers of primary sources of Khazar. The authentication of correspondence has been challenged on the ground that there's little in common with otherwise attested chronology, language, borders, economy of the Khazars at the time. So, absentably, it gives both accounts of Khazar conversion of Judaism over its progress and subsequent generation, as well as potential showing that within generation of fall of the Khazar Empire, the Khazar state still primarily powerful and received tribute from several polities. So what is the Hasdai al-Shaprut writes to King Joseph? I'm just going to read a couple of lines. It says, I'm Hasdai, son of Isaac, son of Ezra, belonging to the exiled Jews of Jerusalem in Sepharad, a servant of my Lord the King, how to the earth before him and prostrate myself toward the a body of the magistracy to a distant land. I rejoice in your tranquility and magnificent, and stretch from my hands to God in heaven that he may be prolonged your reign in Israel. Praise to be the beneficent God for his mercy toward me, kings of the earth to whom. So basically he writes in his letter that I gave the letter to somebody to give it to you through Byzantium, but they won't pass it on to you. How are you doing? I've heard that you guys are Jewish. Can you tell us about it? So he gets a reply from this King Joseph. So this is letter of, Joseph the king, son of the Aaron, the king, the Turk may, his creator, preserve him to the head of the assembly, Hazdai, the son of Isaac, son of Ezra. I wish to inform you that your beautiful phrase letter was given us by Isaac, son Eleazar, and Jew of the land of Germany. So he used a third person from Germany to send from Spain to Hazaria this letter. And he said, Isaac carried it through Germany, Hungary, and Kievan, Rus, and Hazaria. You made us happy, and we were delighted with your understanding and wisdom. Let us, therefore, renew the diplomatic relations that once obtained between our fathers, and let us transmit the heritage to our children. Joseph believed that Khazars had once had diplomatic relations with Spanish Arabs. So the guy was a little confused. So that's, you know, some scholars point to this distinct Kievan Podil, named after Khazars, called Khazari, which indicates some of the Turkic Khazars lived in Kiev. The Khazars apparently played a significant role in economic vitality of city, foreign caviar, fish, whatever. Any questions on this letter? Obviously, this is from Cordoba, famous gardens. No questions? Anybody still there? All right, next one. So, who knows what Genesa is? So let me explain what Genesa. According to Haggadah, the Jewish religion, you're not supposed to destroy religious books or anything that's written in Hebrew. They're considered to be sacred. So within the synagogue, if you can see on the left, there is a Genesa, or the, you say an attic with a hole in it, where they store all the religious books that they don't use anymore. Or they're basically not, you know, or they're very bad, what is it called, condition. So in Cairo, of all the places, they found this Genesa, where it talks about the Hazarian Jews, particularly Jews in Hazaria that lived in Kiev. It's called the Kievan Letter, okay? So Kievan Letter is a 10th century letter thought to be written by a representative of a Jewish community in Kiev. The letter, Hebrew language commendation written on behalf of one of the members of the community, was part of an enormous collection brought to the Cambridge, Salman Schechter, and Cairo Genesa. In
Zach, yeah. Could I refine your definition of a Genesa?
Yes, please. Sorry.
It's not that any Hebrew manuscript has to be preserved. It's that any manuscript, any writing which has the name of God in it, that you cannot destroy. Any manuscript, any paper that would have the name of God in it. That's the reason for a Genesa.
Right. Well, it was refined in Cairo, where they said that because it's in Hebrew letters, it's a God's word. And therefore, any writing, this Kievan letter had nothing to do with religion. It was still preserved.
Okay. Well, I think that Hebrew writings at the time probably evoked the name of God at some point, you know, just as a matter of custom, probably, you know, in the way that very religious Muslims might invoke the name of Allah and Muhammad as his prophet, just before you know, speaking, you know, the rest of the body of the text.
That's true. That's true. So what does the letter say? Thank you, Rob. I'm sorry. On the other hand, the letter itself implies that Khazar authorities could do little to help Jewish community in Kiev. So a Jewish Jew, a Jew that lived in Kiev, writes a letter that Khazars are not helping us. They're Jewish. They're not helping us in Kiev. We're being prosecuted. The letter itself had ended up in Egypt, and belligerent alms seeking had presumably traveled thousands of miles in a search for the relief. the identity, the status of the review officer, therefore ambiguous. It would seem likely that the letter was reviewed in Khazaria while Khazar Jewish power had waned out only in Kiev, but in the heartland itself. So they couldn't help Jews anywhere anymore. Their power had diminished by 11th century, destroyed by the Russian Svetoslav. All right, what is the evidence of Khazaria? Let's just rehash it. We have Rabnites, who were the Jewish merchants, Petache of Regenburg. You have Ibn Daud, who writes about Khazaria. You have Arab accounts, historian Ibn Fadlan, the traveler. You have Christian accounts. You have Constantine Acropolitis, and you have chronicles of bygone years written by the Russian monk in the 10th century. We have Hazarian Coinage, 81 coin marked land of Hazars. 5 coins marked Moses is a messenger of the God. Also marked the Khazars Tamgas. And I want to show you this one on the right in a more expanded fashion. If you can see, this is a burial site in Khazaria with the Jewish menorah in it. If you can see on in the middle.
Zach, what's a Khazar Tamgas in the previous slide?
That's money, dinars. Money.
That's a kind of currency.
Yeah.
Ah, okay, thank you.
No problem. So as you can see, this is clearly also on the previous map, which I provided right here, they found a typical grave of Shevavaro, 1972 Jewish motifs of 70 of the 450 bricks fragments in Hungary, because Hungary were so close, Magyars, the time when they were also traveling, and apparently Hazars was, converted to Judaism, were buried with the Jewish marks as well, and so that's that too. Now let's get to the DNA, and again, I'm not an expert. Assessing the impact of the Khazaria Jews on Eastern European Jewry. Literary evidence, linguistic evidence, cultural evidence. And we come to the genetic evidence. Why DNA studies indicate a high degree of closeness between Jewish men worldwide, ironically, also very close to Palestinians. I don't know how to use it. Mitochondrial DNA shows significant similarities to antichronical those people. 5.2% of Ashkenazi men have a QP36 Y-DNA haplogroup found in Central Asian like Hazars, Uzbeks, also Native Americans. It doesn't say anything. And 2% of Ashkenazi women carry Asian mtDNA. That's my presentation. Any questions?
Wow. Yeah, thank you, Zach.
No, yeah, anytime.
Thank you. So what sort of happened? So what happened to the Kazars? Were they sort of absorbed into other populations that went through there, or?
First, they were destroyed by Svetoslav, who was the Rus, Varangian, Viking, Slavic. Yeah. Then they got conquered by Persians, Russians, whoever had. I mean, look at the territory, man. They used to be it's ridiculous.
Well, this is interesting. See, I'm used to reading about English DNA, and like Britain is off at one end of the continent. You don't really, you can go to Britain, but you don't go through Britain to get anywhere. Whereas we're in an area that's kind of opposite to that. You sort of, everybody crosses through there.
Yeah. Britain was in a good place, as it were, to be out of the way.
And an island.
Not that it wasn't conquered by a number of different waves of people.
I know, right? Anglo-Saxons, Britain, Romans, there's so many. But
I have a question about this map. Now, the the Khazar area is the brown, correct?
That's correct.
Not the green.
That's correct.
Okay. Okay.
Well, at some point they said that Kiev, look how close it was, said found by Khazars. Because
yeah, so I guess the green to a certain degree had Khazar influences at certain times.
Right, that's correct. But you know, and Volga Bulgars were subjugated by Khazars for 200 years.
And now my understanding of what happened to the Kazars, and I don't know the specifics, but that at various times they were allied to Byzantium, to the Byzantine Empire.
That's correct.
And at a certain point, they lost that alliance, lapsed, and the Kazars found themselves confronting the Rus without allies.
That's correct. And also, if you think of it, Byzantium was more inclined to help somebody that converted to their religion, which was Rus.
Yes.
Before, and they also, at the time, Kazars were helping Byzantium by fighting off Arabs or Muslims, coming from Umayyad Caliphate. And if without that, then Byzantium might have been circled and taken over. They had a lot of holdings in Crimea and all that stuff. So it's interesting that Khazar had actually saved the Western world. Again, Jews saved the Western. I'm just kidding. I don't think they were. I mean, only the top were Jewish. The rest was following it. Probably didn't give up, and it was just a lot of Jews that came to the area because of the Leo prosecuting and trying to convert Jews, and they moved. But it's interesting. This letter, they say, it was written by the Khagan of the Khazars to the Al-Shaprut. So, I don't know if it's real, if it's not, but who's going to go in such an extent and try to fake something like this? I don't know. But it's been also, there's archaeological, discoveries of coinage with Moses in it, and burial grounds. Could be just the Jews that lived there in a big number.
The Pulitzer Prize winning novelist Michael Chabon, he wrote a serialized a novel that was serialized in the New York Times Magazine back in 2007. It was called Gentlemen of the Road, and it was an adventure tale. I mean, quite a fantasy, in which a couple of wandering Jews who were described as conmen and bandits got involved in Khazarian politics. They tried to aid that. Well, they were aiding a young Khazarian prince, whose name I think was either Hanukkah or Pesach, named for a Jewish holiday. It's just an oddity where these. I think one of the Jews was Ashkenazi and the other was Sephardic. So this was kind of a swashbuckling adventure tale about, featuring these radically different kinds of Jews set about 1,000 years ago.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. Yeah. I mean, there was a question that was posed. I appreciate it. Thank you all. It's interesting. There was a question offered. They say, are there any museum or archaeological sites there now? So I went to the St. Petersburg Museum, where they collect most of the areas particularly Scythians, who actually predate Khazars in the area. I have not seen one artifact, maybe to the fact that, Tsar was very anti-Semitic, maybe to the fact that it's part of the, Kurgan. They have actually a separate exhibition. I didn't get to it, where I don't know if you know what kurgan is where they bury the dead people, particularly of the noble descent. And but within the Scythian or any kind of exhibit in St. Petersburg Hermitage, I did not see one artifact from Khazaria. I did see an artifact of Hazarian Metropolitan Museum of Art. So in Russia, they tried to probably erase that, the fact that there was a Jewish state.
There was also actually a fairly well-known historical philosophical work that was written by a medieval rabbi, Yehuda Halevi, a rather famous named poet and philosopher, called the Kuzari. And it takes place during a conversion of Khazar nobility to Judaism.
Yeah,
and it's in the Wikipedia article, it says the historicity of the event is debated. But here you have a book that was written in 1140 by a well-known Jewish authority who's looking back at this period about the Kazars. So, it certainly has a strong a strong basis in legend, and the degree to which it's factual. There is some evidence. It's not ironclad, but actually, you have the specimens of the coins and that sort of thing. There evidently is something there. What exactly there is is a question of analysis.
Yeah, obviously we have burial grounds, and I don't know any Turkic of that. I don't know if even where I live in Uzbekistan, the Khwarezm Empire had, the Khwarezm Khaganate had Jews there. Jews were brought there apparently with Genghis Khan in my area in Uzbekistan.
Mm-hmm.
So there was no Turkic government that kept Jews, So this was very unique, and the fact that they actually somewhat, maybe did take up the religion, maybe didn't. I don't know. It's up in the air. Obviously, the fact that they didn't have any chronicles themselves, and then this King Joseph, out of nowhere, writes this huge letter to Al Shaprut. And then the one you just mentioned, he wrote that 200 years after the Khaganate was gone. So it also was not a contemporary writing, so to speak.
I think there's some reality to it. It's just a little hard to define what that reality exactly was.
There are still Jewish areas, Jewish remnants of Jewish people, religious Jewish people in North Caucasus, in Dagestan, and so-called mountain Jews.
Right, right.
And basically, this is the area where Khaganate was. So it could be the remnants of the Khaganate people.
Yeah,
there.
So Zach, you might be Khazarian when you go back.
My daughter did a DNA, and I didn't do my DNA, but she's 20% from Caucasus and 20% Middle East. And from my wife's side, there's a little Ashkenazi going on.
There is a book out on Nazi race science during World War II. And they were commenting. I lent my copy out, so I don't have the name of the book of the author. I lent it to a friend. They commented when they got out of the caucus, the racial mixing was absolutely incredible. They couldn't make sense of it.
Yeah. And then,
like they were trying to figure out who to exterminate.
Yeah. What's interesting.
And who to get along with.
Yeah. To Mikhail's point, the mountain Jews are the same Jews as Bukharian Jews. They're just called Tats. We speak the same language.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It has nothing to do with Kazars. They actually came from Persian Empire like we did. They came from, well, essentially it came from Babylon to Persia and to through Caucasus, some stayed in Caucasus, some went to Uzbekistan, Bukhara. That's how we arrived. We speak absolutely the same language. They're just called mountain Jews. We call Bukharian Jews.
Okay.
Persian,
I'm wondering, you know, somewhat tangential to this. Are the Tajik also a Turkic people?
No, they're
Persian.
Oh, they're Persian, and I'm asking because there are Uzbeks and Tajiks in Afghanistan, right?
Yeah.
And the Tajiks, in fact, are famously anti-Taliban.
That's correct.
Right.
So there was let me explain to you. During the war against Soviet Union, there was several factions that were involved. Uzbek were led by the General Dustu, who is right now is in the government of the current government of Afghanistan.
Could you talk a little louder?
Yeah, the Uzbeks in Afghanistan was led by the General Dustu.
Right.
He repelled Russian, Soviet forces, and he led Uzbek militia. Then they had Tajik or Farsi, because they were there's a couple of Farsi speaking factions. His name is Mahsud.
Yes.
And Mahsud was leading the Tajik area, and then there was a bunch of tribal Urdu, different. So they broke into different sections. So when Nasibullah, who was the president, who was no longer was backed by Soviets, obviously got conquered, they divided the country in 4 different parts: Tajik, Uzbek, Urdu, and then there was other factions. Pushtu. Pushtu. And the Pushtu is the one that created Taliban, and they're taking over the rest of the areas. But Dostum and Mahsud as the one repelled Taliban and helped the United States to reestablish somewhat, shaky, peace, whatever you call it.
Yeah, well, Mahsud was assassinated 2 days before the attacks of 9/11. But I saw a news segment on PBS, I think it was last week, with Mahsud, with his son, and his son is now a leader of this group. He speaks excellent English.